Hello my friend and welcome to my channel Razib. I hope that you're well. So let's start a new section about JavaScript. And in this section we'll take a look behind the scene of JavaScript and learn how the language actually works. So through this section we'll take your basic knowledge of JavaScript and elevate it to a completely new level, where you will then understand exactly how everything that you learned before actually works under the hood. And this is actually extremely important because this knowledge will really empower you to write better code and to understand other developers' code. And so, in the end, it will make you a better, more confident and more successful developer. And finally, knowing how JavaScript really works will also set you apart from competition, because many other junior developers simply don't know about much of this stuff. So don't be scared of theory and let's get started. As an introduction to this theory section, I want to start with a very cool and very high level overview about the JavaScript language. And so you get first overview of most of the things that we need to learn in order to eventually master JavaScript. And this is gonna be a long video, so get ready for a crazy ride. And I want to start by coming back to that first definition that I gave you on JavaScript, where I told you that JavaScript is a high-level, object-oriented, multi-paradigm programming language. Now, this is, of course, 100% correct, but it's also really just the surface, the tip of the iceberg. So what about this definition? Oops. Haha. JavaScript is high level, prototype based, object oriented, multi-paradigm, interpreted or just-in-time compiled, dynamic, single-threaded, garbage-collected programming language with a first-class function, and a non-blocking event loop concurrency model. Wait, what is this? Is this some kind of joke? Well, yeah. It kind of is. Actually, I just packaged as much information as possible about JavaScript into one understandable and readable sentence just for fun. But besides fun, this is also give us a great opportunity to unpack all of this in order to get first peek into all of the stuff that we are gonna learn about JavaScript through the course. And this is not to intimidate you, it is really not. I just want you to get the big picture before really getting started, and also introduce some of the topics that are just good to know, because getting the big picture before diving deep is my opinion an amazing learning technique. So with that being said, let's unpack this now a little bit. Okay? So let's start. So these are the 9 JavaScript topics that we are briefly gonna talk about in this video, slightly ordered. And starting with the high level part, as you may already know, every program that runs on your computer needs some hardware resource as a memory and the CPU to do its work. Now, there are low-level language such as C, where you have to manually manage this resource. For example, asking the computer for memory to create a new variable. On the other side, you have a high-level language such as JavaScript and Python, where we do not have to manage resource at all, because this language has so-called abstraction that take all of that work away from us. This makes the language easier to learn and to use, but the downside is that programs will never be as fast or as optimized as, for example, C programs. Now, one of the powerful tools that takes memory management away from us developer is garbage collection, which is basically an algorithm inside the JavaScript engine, which automatically removed all unused objects from the computer memory in order not to close it close it up with unnecessary stuff. So it is a little bit like JavaScript has cleaning guy who cleans our memory from time to time, so that we don't have to do it manually in our code. Okay? Next up, JavaScript is an interpreted or just-in-time compiled language. And again, we will learn more about this in this section. But what you need to know for now is that the computer processor only understands 0 and 1s. That's right. Okay? Ultimately, every single program needs to be written in 0 and 1s, which is also called machine code. And since that's not really practical to write, is it? We simply write human-readable JavaScript code, which is an abstraction over machine code, but this code eventually needs to be translated to machine code. Okay? And that step can be either compiling or interpreting. This step is necessary in every single programming language because no one writes machine code manually. In the case of JavaScript, this happens inside the JavaScript engine. Now, one of the things that makes JavaScript so popular is the fact that it is a multi-paradigm language. Okay? In programming, a paradigm is an approach and overall mindset of structuring our code, which will ultimately direct the coding style and technique in projects that use a certain paradigm. And this definition still sounds kind of abstract, but don't worry, it will become more clear as we move on. Now, three popular paradigms are procedural, object-oriented, and functional programming. So, procedural programming is what we have been doing so far, which is basically just organizing the code in a very linear way, and then with some function in between. Now, about object-oriented programming and functional programming, I will talk about them in a second. Also, we can classify paradigm as an imperative or as a declarative, but again, more on that later. Now, many languages are only procedural, or only object-oriented, or only functional, but JavaScript does all of it. So it is really flexible and versatile. And so we can do really whatever we want with it. It's our choice. We can use whatever paradigm we want. And in this course, I will show you how to use all of them, inshallah. Okay? So about the object-oriented nature of JavaScript, it is prototype-based, object-oriented approach. Now, what does that mean? Well, first, almost everything in JavaScript is an object, except for primitive values such as numbers, strings, etc. But arrays, for example, are just objects. And we already saw that in practice, right? Now, have you ever wondered why we can create an array and then use the push method on it, for example? Well, it's because of prototype inheritance. Basically, we create arrays from an array blueprint, which is like a template, and this is called the prototype. This prototype contains all the array method and the arrays that we create in our code. Then inherit the method from the blueprint so we can use them on the arrays. And this, what I just explained to you, is actually a hug oversimplification, which may still sound confusing. And that's the reason why there is a whole section on object-oriented programming with JavaScript later in this course. But since this is a big overview video, I want to first introduce this topic right here. Next up, JavaScript is a language with first class function, which simplify means that functions are treated just as a regular variable. So we can pass functions into other functions, and we can even return functions from functions. And this is extremely powerful because it allows us to use a lot of powerful technique, and also allows for functional programming, which is one of the paradigms that we just talked about before. And in fact, we have already used the power of first-class functions without knowing that they are called first-class functions. So remember, this piece of code that we wrote for closing the model window that we built before. So right here, we pass the close model function into the add event listener function. And if it was just a regular variable, right? And actually, not all languages have a first-class function, but JavaScript has, and it's amazing. Believe me, it's really, really helpful. Next, I said that JavaScript is dynamic language, and dynamic actually means dynamically typed. So, as we have already seen in JavaScript, we don't assign data type to variables. Instead, they only became known when the JavaScript engine executes our code. Also, the type of variables can easily be changed as we assign variables, and this is basically what dynamically typed means. Now, there is a lot of controversy if this is good or bad, but this is just how it works. Now, the same is not true for most other programming language, where we have to manually assign type to variable, and this then usually prevent bugs from happening, which is the reason why many people say that JavaScript should be a strongly typed language as well. And if you yourself want to use JavaScript with type, then you can always look into TypeScript. But anyway, let's now finally talk about the single thread and the non-blocking event loop concurrency model. Now this is really a complex topic, and probably the most complex one of the whole course, which is why it's kind of at the end of the course. And therefore, I'm not gonna go into specific here just yet, but instead I will just define some things here. First, what actually is a concurrency model? Well, it is just a fancy term that means how the JavaScript engine handles multiple tasks happening at the same time. Now, okay, that's cool. But why do we need that? Well, because JavaScript itself runs in one single thread, which means that it can only do one thing at a time, and therefore we need a way of handling multiple things happening at the same time. And by the way, in computing, a thread is like a set of instructions that is executed in the computer CPU. So basically, the thread is where our code is actually executed in a machine processors. Alright, but what if there is a long-running task, like fetching data from a remote server? Well, it sounds like that would block the single thread where the code is running, right? But of course, we don't want that. What we want is a so-called non-blocking behavior. And how do we achieve that? Well, by using a so-called event loop. The event loop takes long-running tasks, executes them in the background, and then puts them back in the main thread once they are finished. And this is, in a nutshell, JavaScript's non-blocking event loop concurrency model with a single thread. It sounds like a mouthful for sure, but in the end, it's really just compressed to this. Just keep in mind that again, this is a hug oversimplification that we will come back to. Alright, and this is actually round up this overview video. I know there was a ton of stuff to take in, but I hope that you will still learn a thing or two here. So see you in the next video, inshallah, to continue our course. Stay focused. Don't give up. Don't give up. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel Faisal Azib, to follow me on Instagram, and also to like our Facebook page, Real Practice and Share. Take care of us. I will tell you goodbye. Wassalamu alaikum wa barakatuh.